Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frank Rhodes Lecture at Arizona State University. My name is Minu Ai. I serve as Vice Chair and Managing Director of the University Design Institute. And on behalf of the organizing team and the ASU community, I want to warmly welcome you all to this lecture on the Generative University, launching a new era of excellence delivered by Chancellor Richard Lyons of UC Berkeley. We are delighted to have him here with us. And in a moment, I will turn it over to President Crow to introduce our scholar. But I'd like to take a moment to give you the origin story about the Frank Rhodes Lecture Series for those of you that are new to this conversation with us. Dr. Crow created the Frank Rhodes Lecture Series in 2011 in honor of Frank Rhodes, who served as the president of Cornell University from 1977 to 1995. Frank Rhodes is considered one of the most impactful university presidents of the 20th century, driving a vision to fundamentally change and evolve the landscape of higher education. During his almost 22-year tenure at Cornell, he changed the course of the university. He had an unfailing drive and perseverance to bolster student and faculty diversity. Research funding increased from 88 million to over 300 million annually. He led successful fundraising campaigns to redesign the Cornell landscape for generations to come, and these are a few examples. In 2001, he published a book called The Creation of the Future, which discussed the responsibilities and possibilities of American higher education. The ideas in this book were really powerful and were an important influence in shaping the new American university model here at Arizona State University. So through this lecture series, we honor Frank Rhodes and his vision to change US higher education for greater impact for generations to come. Now, the scholars we invite are leaders and experts who in their own fields are pushing the evolution of 21st century higher education. They are and have advanced bold ideas, forcing us all to think about what we should be doing within our institutions and within higher education more broadly. So these lectures are meant to inspire, inform, and educate us and support our ongoing journey of transformation here at ASU and for all of you who have joined us from outside in the spaces that you inhabit as well. A quick word on housekeeping. So we will turn it over next to Dr. Crow for an introduction, following which Chancellor Lyons will deliver his lecture for about 20 to 30 minutes. You'll have an opportunity to put in your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will not have a chat facility for this discussion. At the end of the lecture, I will moderate a discussion based on your questions, and I will try to get in as many as I possibly can in the time we have together. Please know that we will record the lecture and make it available on the Frank Rhodes Lecture Series website here at ASU. It will be available next week. If you know of colleagues and friends who would be excited to hear about the ideas shared here, please feel free to share the website and the link to the lecture as well. So with that, let me turn it over to President Crow of Arizona State University to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Manu. It's really great to have an opportunity to get everyone together again and have a chance to hear from someone like Rich Lyons, who brings a distinguished academic career at sort of what I call the higher systems level way of thinking about really complicated things in terms of markets, societal level signals in the way that economies are operating. He has thought about, taught about, and led around issues like cultural leadership and values. How do you instill values in organizations? How do you move organizations forward in new and exciting kinds of ways? And then now, in the last few years, as Chancellor at UC Berkeley, which is, of course, one of the motherships of American higher education, having been the original campus of the University of California, all the way back when the land-grant university model was getting going, and then the new state of California. Rich sent me a few months ago their new book coming out of Berkeley called Startup Campus, how UC Berkeley became an unexpected leader in entrepreneurship and startups. What he means by leader is beating everybody else in the whole country by graduates and faculty and so forth, starting new companies and so forth. So, in my interactions with Rich, what I've seen is in him is an unbelievable design level thinking. How do we help the university to be of greater impact? How do we help the people of California, the people of the United States, to be more successful? How do you take, one of the motherships of American higher education and make it more impactful? So Rich brings, through the finance, economics, business track. He was dean of the Haas School for a while. I think I read that you're the first UC Berkeley undergraduate to be the chancellor of Berkeley. So that's a huge achievement in and of itself. And so Rich, in my interactions with him, has really been unbelievably thoughtful in the questions of design. And we've talked about, how it is that we need different kinds of universities, different types of universities taking on different missions, but working together in an alliance and so forth. So Rich, it's really exciting to have you here. Frank had an immense impact on us here at ASU and our design, and we've sort of taken a different kind of a path from Berkeley, but have been heavily influenced by the Berkeley model. So everyone's looking forward to what you have to say and how you can help us all to be better thinkers and better designers. So, Rich, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Minu. I appreciate the opportunity. And, Michael and ASU's under your leadership, the leadership for higher ed more generally. I mean, the different kinds of universities, people will sometimes in a shorthand way say higher ed is this or higher ed is that. And there are just so many different parts to higher ed and different models, as you said. And I think you're helping us think about new ones and fresher ones at that. So anyways, I want to thank you for all your leadership. So today I'm going to try and keep my comments, it was mentioned 20 to 30 minutes. I'm going to try and keep it closer to 20 because I think Q&A will be the most fun as we move through this. I do, of course, have some ideas up front. The title of the talk, The Generative University, I mean, these, whether you're talking about ASU or Berkeley or any of our universities, these universities are among society's most valuable assets. I mean, people can disagree about whether they should be moving this direction or that direction or changing in these ways. But it's pretty hard to confront, to argue with the idea that they are among society's most valuable assets. That's part of why they're getting so much darn attention in American society today, precisely because they are very important. So to what use shall we put them over the next decade, right? That's what's at stake here. And there's a lot at stake here, and that's been discussed. That's not my topic. But so the generative university, they've been generative. In what ways can we sort of increase that generativity? And what do we mean by that? Or what do I mean by that? Of course, there are many things we might mean by that. I have 4 quick topics that I want to cover in those 20 minutes or remaining 18 or whatever I have. One is to connect the word generative or the concept of generativity to the mission. At the end of the day, that's our job as university leaders, is to advance the mission. And it's sort of like, so how does generativity connect to that? And I just thought I would start there. It's starting at a high altitude, but I think it's important to start there because some of the things that I'll talk about, some people, depending upon how they think about the mission, may think about some of the things I say and say, is that really kind of mission advancing? And should we be doing that? So I want to make sure that the mission frame is well understood. The second topic of the 4, I want to talk about generativity as a flywheel, as a two-way process that builds on itself. We can think about generativity as like, look at these fundamental research results, right? Or look at these translational research results, or look at these companies, or look at these beautifully, wonderfully educated people and all they're contributing to society. That's all generativity. But we need to keep that going, right? It needs to feed back into the system and keep the system thriving. So that's the flywheel notion, and I'll say a little bit more about that. The third topic, I am sort of a nut for culture. Michael mentioned it. How do leaders shape culture, and how is culture shaped in universities? And by culture, I mean, I'm really focusing mostly on shared behavioral norms. I mean, ultimately, culture is bigger than that, certainly as an anthropologist would define it. But I'm thinking about shared behavioral norms and attitudes and the values that undergird those behaviors. But at the end of the day, it's mostly about behaviors that I want to talk about. So my third topic, I'm going to call it generative and culture number one, but I've got a specific slice on culture that I want to talk about and connect it to generativity. And then my fourth topic is generative and culture number two. There's a second slice on culture. And the second of those two slices, just real quickly, is like, what is the clock speed? What is the clock speed on our change capacity? I mean, how quickly can we adapt if we're going to get more generative? These are most of these wonderful institutions, educational institutions, are large institutions, right? And the world is moving very fast, and our ability to keep up with that movement, it involves some internal cultural changes, and I want to talk a bit about that. Okay, so those are the four topics I want to cover. Back to the first one, generative and mission. What do I have in mind here? So when we think about a mission statement, sometimes people will say, well, it's the three things that we always talk about. It's research, education or teaching, and public service. Those are profoundly important. Obviously, they are what we do, but they are what we do. Those are the profound hows. That's how we prosecute our mission. The why, if we're going to start with why, is generating long-term societal benefit. Now, different universities will use slightly different phrasing, but there is always a very compact, deep why phrase that has to do with producing or generating long-term societal benefit. And one could use different adjectives and different verbs, but that's the why, and that's actually quite critical. Because when we talk about the profoundly important hows, like research, teaching, and service, let me just use a concrete example. If somebody said, well, Michael mentioned startups, and Berkeley's producing all these startups, new companies, new jobs, livelihoods, and therapeutics, and products and services. Yeah. But somebody could say, but that's not the mission. The mission is research, teaching. Okay, public service, maybe I can shoehorn that into public service. It's sort of like, right? So if we start with why, generating long-term societal benefit, then the idea that all those things that are coming out of these universities is in fact advancing of the fundamental why of the mission. It's just a lot easier to see how universities can benefit society even further in that way. So maybe starting at too abstract a level, but we have to start with why. We do have to start with why. We are about generating long-term societal benefit, and people can disagree about exactly how to do that well. But I want to make sure that frame is capacious enough so you can understand what I'm about to say, my remaining 3 points within that frame or under that umbrella. Okay, so that's connecting to the mission. Let's go to number two, this flywheel notion. So the two-way connectivity, with generativity. Here, I do want to talk about innovation and entrepreneurship. And I want to talk about how, I don't want to get into the details of company creation and so forth. What I do want to talk about is, how does an ASU or a Berkeley or any of our universities, how do we benefit more in a kind of self-flourishing way from the economic value that we are creating? Because ultimately we have to sustain ourselves. I mean, federal funding for research is on its way down. That's pretty clear. How far down, we're not sure. So as we think about these models, how do we participate more in the economic value we are creating? I won't go into, there are many different measures. How much economic value does an ASU create? It's like, depending upon how you measure it, it's eye-popping. It's just absolutely enormous. Now, the idea that we should be entitled to all of that, or even most of that, that's a silly thought. But how do we, in ways that are consistent with our values, that's critical, consistent with our values, how do we participate more in the economic value we create? Now, the old answer, or the traditional answer to that question, usually was around intellectual property. Okay, it's royalties. Like, you have some IP coming out of mostly scientific research, so it's that piece. And how do we capture some of that? And that's still operating. My view is that's not the center of the game here. That's not where generativity as a flywheel is actually operating. So let me clarify why I think we've largely moved on from that. Not to say that IP and return of economics from IP isn't important, but it's not at the center as I see it. So what is at the center if that's not at the center? And I think part of what's happening at Berkeley, at ASU, at most of our institutions is one of the things that started happening about 20 years ago, but there are many, many other examples. I'll just use this one example. Increasingly, universities are saying, oh, if you're a startup and we have some intellectual property and you want to license that intellectual property, we will license it to you, but we would like to have 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever % of your company. Right. And that's obviously a negotiation. You don't get anything for free. And usually you have to dial royalties down a little bit in order to participate in equity. But that's interesting because, startups can get acquired and or have what's called an initial public offering. And so payback to the university can be much faster than the 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20-year, product development cycles, depending upon whether we're in life sciences or computer sciences is much, much faster than that. But so I'll call that licensing acquired equity. All right. So it's like interesting. Like how many licensing acquired equities does Berkeley have? And you might think, like, is it 10, 15, 20? It's like, well, we've been doing this for 20 years. So is ASU and others. About 150. Sort of like, well, that's interesting. Are those still alive? What if you put it in a spreadsheet and you analyze it? And what's the likely, you can't know what any of these is going to pay out. Some have already paid out, of course. Okay, so that's interesting. So then if you said, wait a minute, if I use this, this sort of equity mentality, this participating in what I'll call, pardon the jargon, the nonlinear upside of economic value creation, right? That's not just, 3% of every, a royalty or something like that. How interesting is that? And if that's one of the channels in a spreadsheet, one of the equity channels in a spreadsheet, licensing acquired equity, what are the other channels? And how many different rows are there in the spreadsheet that analyzes the equity participation upside of a UC Berkeley? Okay, so that's kind of the frame here. And I have a spreadsheet, I suspect Michael has one too, that doesn't just include like what I call licensing acquired equity. That's sort of kind of the next generation on returns to intellectual property. There are 14 other rows in that spreadsheet. It's got about 15 rows in it. Each row is a different channel through which Berkeley is acquiring in values consistent ways. I just want to double underline that, right? We are not a hedge fund. We are not a venture capital fund. How do you do this in ways that make sense? And I'll give you some more examples. And I'm not going to walk you through the whole spreadsheet. That's not a good use of our time. But there are 15 different rows. And each of them is a different row, different mechanism, channel through which Berkeley is participating in the nonlinear equity upside. Now, it's a spreadsheet, for crying out loud. Why is it a spreadsheet? It's like low, medium, high on each of those rows, 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. How big is this? And if somebody said, well, Berkeley's budget, this is all public information, is about $4 billion a year. If somebody said, yeah, in 10 years, it'll be $10 million a year, it'd be like, that's a lot of money, but that doesn't change the game. When you start looking at things that can be $100 million of unrestricted, that's key because we need to fund the core. We need to fund the core of these great universities, including the research core, especially the research core. An incremental $100 million of unrestricted cash flows type. Oh, that's different. That matters in a big way. Okay. So I won't walk you. I don't think I'm going to say too much more about exactly what the numbers look like at Berkeley, but let me give you a couple more examples of what these rows look like. And then I'm going to move on to my next topic. One of the rows is there are 7 external venture capital funds. So these are external entities that have signed an affiliation agreement with Berkeley. We call these shared carry funds. I'll explain the jargon word carry in just a second. But in each of those cases, and these are funds that are investing a lot in Berkeley, mostly in companies coming out of UC Berkeley. In each of those cases, the general partner has contractually committed, not I'll make a gift back to Berkeley, I promise. It's contractually committed half of their return, what's called the carry, half of their upside back to Berkeley. So specifically, if $1 gets paid out to a general partner as part of that carry, part of that upside return, 50 cents of it automatically comes to Berkeley. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Like, okay, there's 7 of those. How big are the funds? Are those funds, what's the likely multiple on those funds, using the jargon of venture capital? Is that a fund that's going to take its initial paid-in capital and multiply it by 3 or by 2 or by 4? It's sort of like, that's why it's a spreadsheet, so we can go through all of that. Like, well, that's interesting. Okay, so that's one other channel. I'll give you another example, and I'll stop here. But this idea of how do we create a flywheel that's going to get back to Berkeley and get back to Berkeley in largely or as much as possible unrestricted ways, because we need to fund the core. If somebody said, okay, it's all coming back in, but it's all going to engineering, for example, it'd be like, oh, that's not a wide angle enough flywheel to power what Berkeley needs to power, right? So the unrestrictedness is important. Here's a third channel. We have received about $75 million or so of philanthropy over the last year or so, maybe probably a year and a half now. And it all came in with a restriction. And the restriction was this philanthropy is going to go into one of those 7 shared carry funds. So that's money that comes into Berkeley with a restriction. You have to use it this way. But Berkeley is investing as a limited partner, as one of the underlying investors, in one of those 7 so-called shared carry funds. And of course, when it comes out the other side, it's unrestricted. Or if the donor has a specific interest, there may be some uses that are specified up front. But it's sort of like, oh, that's interesting, right? So that's real money. It's also money that I don't believe it could have gone to X and you just sent it to Y. I think this was genuinely incremental money. But that can be discussed. But I think the idea here is, okay, if a multiple of 3 times over 10 to 12 years is pretty common on a venture capital fund. So that's 75 becomes 225. Now, 225 million over 12 years by itself is not a complete game changer. But you start adding it up with the other rows. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Flywheel. We need to be generative. And in this case, we're generative of companies, as ASU and other universities are. And we are participating more in that nonlinear equity upside, and like lots of different ways. And that's gonna be a fundamental. I think of it as like a new cylinders in the economic engine of a great research university. All right, enough there. I'm going to talk about number 3 and number 4, my final 2 topics, and then we can lean into. I've been at it already for 16 minutes, so I'm gonna be a little quicker on these 2 and make sure we have time for Q&A. Generative and culture. Example number 1: generative and culture. When we think a little bit about, and there are a million ways to think about generativity, right? And so the idea that the frame I'm putting on it, right? It's sort of like, well, there's very innovation and entrepreneurship inflected. I'll just put that out there up front. I am in this talk being inflected that way. But the fundamental research that Nobel Prizes are won based on is the root source of preeminence of so many of our universities. We can't forget that. That's really fun. The fundamental research really is the root source of our contributions to society, and education is of course important as well. But so that's super important. When we start thinking about this culture element, I want to talk a bit about how do you shift faculty culture and how do you shift student culture around the idea that, part of advancing the mission of a Berkeley is creating new enterprises, right? They don't have to be for profit. They don't have to have equity. These can be not-for-profit enterprises, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They can be public sector enterprises. So let's not get too bogged down in the idea that, oh, you're just talking about equity and you're just talking about private sector. If we thought about enterprise creation more widely, sort of like, how do you get students more geared toward enterprise creation? Okay. And at some level, you have to affect the cognitive shift for undergraduates, especially from they do that. Somebody else does that. Oh, people that create companies, I don't know, that's not where I come from. And they do that. We need to affect the cognitive shift from they do that to I do that. We want more students with that sense of agency. That's a word that I find is very powerful. A sense of agency. I can act on the world. I could do this. I could create some kind of enterprise if I wanted to. Again, it doesn't have to be private sector. Now, you could try to do that by launching 10 more sections of Entrepreneurship 101 or whatever. That's not going to do it, in my view. You need to provide a narrative that helps the culture among the students begin to shift, begin to frame things in a different way. And we've tried to do that. I'm not saying we've done that exactly right. And but I will give an example at Berkeley that has actually been quite successful. So I will actually, let me describe kind of how this played out, and then I'll tell you the title of it in just a moment. But again, the idea is find a narrative that, the sociologist says, I'm interested. The classics undergraduate, I'm interested. Name your undergraduate, doesn't matter what. All right. So we launched a course in the summer of 2020. So it was actually in COVID. This was an online course. And over 500 students signed up. It's like, whoa, something's happening here, right? To borrow from the old Buffalo Springfield lyric, something's happening here. And so how do we scale that? So this program now, I'll give you the title in 1 second, but the program now is 40 courses. And all 40 of those courses have 3 through lines in them, 3 content through lines. Critical thinking, AKA problem solving, critical thinking, communication, and collaboration. Critical thinking, communication, and collaboration. So the title of the course that we launched in 2020 is called The Berkeley Changemaker. Now, we are not the first to use the word changemaker. We felt that if we put Berkeley in front of it and framed it in exactly this way, that it would have a life, take on a life of its own, and it apparently has. In any event, so now there are 40 courses that are under this umbrella of the Berkeley Changemaker program, and I think one way to think about that is this is allowing, again, affecting that cognitive shift from they do that to I do that. That's something that we want more and more and more students like, I could do that, right? I may not choose to do that, but I could choose that. And I think that's important. We've all, as educators, most of us, I think on this call or this Zoom are educators. We often use the phrase, I think rightly, you can't be what you can't see, right? So it's sort of like, am I the kind of person? Do I see myself as the kind of person who starts stuff? And whatever that is, that's a sense of agency we want to develop. Okay, so that program is taken off, the Berkeley Changemaker program. You can find out more information if you're interested on the website. But again, I think of that as a culture shifting exercise. Right? It's sort of a set of behaviors that starts to shift. It's a mindset shift. And we couldn't have affected that by saying, we've got more sections of entrepreneurship. You should take it. Okay. So here's a second piece. I'm still on this generative culture #1, but on the faculty side, and I'll be quicker on this one, but I could send you to some links if you're interested in seeing it. I think 25 years ago, most of you know UC Berkeley, go back 20 or 25 years ago, the idea that Berkeley would become #1 in America at producing venture-funded startups, and anyways, PitchBook data are very clear on this. Faculty is sort of like, well, why, we're a very public research university, right? Is this kind of where Berkeley, should we be encouraging this? Is this where Berkeley should go? Should our faculty, be starting companies and that kind of thing? And today, I think things have shifted quite a lot. I think people really, in fact, virtually completely. Now, we don't want our faculty not doing fundamental research and just starting companies. But if I could use Jennifer Doudna as an example, won the Nobel Prize for her CRISPR work here on the Berkeley campus. I think, and this is key, I think that there was a mythology, I'm going to call it a mythology, that basically said that fundamental research and translational research are, I'm an economist, in the jargon of my field, fundamental and translational research are substitutes. And I believe that's wrong. I believe they are complements. I believe that all the companies that have come out of Berkeley to support CRISPR technology, started by Jennifer Doudna postdocs or Jennifer Doudna graduate students and so forth, are not pulling Jennifer Doudna away from fundamental research, are in fact driving new resources into her lab and into her fundamental research capacity. They are complements, not substitutes. That's a pretty important idea. And it's a debatable one, right? I think reasonable people can disagree on this, but it's sort of like, name it, call it out, talk about it. That's part of how faculty get comfortable with the idea that Berkeley is producing a lot of new enterprises. Again, not just private sector. All right. So that's the kind of thing that I talk about quite often. Let me give you 2 other quick examples of the shift in faculty culture. #1, and there better be a lot of levers. If somebody says, oh, I did X, I'm shifting, faculty culture. It's like X ain't going to shift faculty culture by itself. Tell me 20 things that are happening. So I'm going to give you 3 examples, but it's like, if you want to bring intention to moving culture among students or among faculty, it's like, you better have a lot of levers and you better work a lot of them. Here are 2 more examples of faculty culture shift. The idea that this is advancing genuinely of Berkeley's mission. Here's one. There is a memo. It's on our website. You can find it. If you go to a website, IAND, so innovation and entrepreneurship, but the website address is IANDE.berkeley.edu. If you go to that website, you will find a document on there that is a memo. And it is a memo that was written from the system-wide provost. We're part of a 10-campus University of California system. From the system-wide chief academic officer to all 10 of the chancellors. I was not a chancellor at that time. And it says that the academic personnel manual that governs Berkeley promotion and tenure at not Berkeley, just Berkeley, the University of California. It is now the case that innovation and entrepreneurship activity on behalf of our faculty counts positively toward promotion and tenure. Now, it's a little bit more specific than that, but that's the message. Now, okay, you could say, well, a lot of universities have done that. That's so that by itself is not earth-shattering. But one of the things that I did is, when I got a copy of that memo, it's like I posted it on the website. Right? And it's sort of like, oh, somebody's going to slap your hand. You shouldn't have put that on the website. It's like, nobody slapped my hand yet. But the important thing is, I want people to see it. To see it. When I sent that to donors, they were ecstatic. These are some of the donors that have been funding some of the other things that are going on at Berkeley. Right? So it's easy. It's like, that exists. The change has happened. It's sort of like, no, that's not the way a culture warrior works. Right? It's sort of like, that's a culture opportunity. And so we posted the memo. Here's one other thing, and then I'll move on to my last topic. This is more on the faculty culture change side. We posted something. You can find it on that ind.berkeley.edu website easily. It's the top 100 faculty founders at Berkeley. And it's a single page and it's clickable. If it's like you click on a name, it's like, oh, that's what that person works on. Anyways, but it's like, yeah. It's a website. It's sort of like, oh. I mean, 10 years ago, now I'm speculating, but 10 years ago, I think many Berkeley faculty would have said, take my name off of that website. I'm a scholar first. Yeah, I've created a company or two or three or whatever, but I'm a scholar first. Yeah. Now that's not, people are not saying take my name off that. And of course, a document like that is very helpful for VCs or other that want venture capitalists that want to navigate Berkeley more effectively, but that's kind of not the point of it. We posted it as a culture-changing lever and instrument. And by itself, it has no impact or next to no impact. But part of 20 or 30 things that you bring intention to sort of shift culture toward the idea that this is mission advancing, I think it's very real. Look, I should maybe just, before I go to my last topic here, is there a place too far on this? Yeah, there is, right? The idea that it's just more startups, more of this, more venture, more of the, it's like we're universities. I earlier said, the root source of our preeminence is fundamental research. We can debate that. I think Berkeley and ASU, we're great at education. We're really good at translational research. We're really good at public service. But the world knows us because of the fundamental research we do. We're not going to forget that. And if some of this starts running at cross purposes to that, then it's sort of like, yeah, let's debate this. And we may have gone too far. But again, that complementarity idea, if we are doing this and we are adding more value to society and it's creating a flywheel that's going to allow Berkeley to get better at the most fundamental things, including research, boom, that's a different picture. So there is a place too far, but I think we need to manage it very closely. Last of my comments, and then I will stop. I realize I've been at it for... I've got to stop in just a moment. Last one, culture number 2. Clock speed on change capacity. Look, the world is moving even faster. Every generation would say that. I think our capacity to move with it at a pace that looks anything like, if you just thought about the AI revolution, the bio revolution, climate science, energy science, it's like, wow, these are moving quickly. Like the next 10 years are going to be pivotal in a bunch of these areas. How does Berkeley, how does ASU keep up? And Michael and ASU have already done so many things on this front. Let me just give you one concrete idea in this capacity, but it's sort of like Berkeley is like, get operational. It's like, yeah, you could, startups and funding and all, it's sort of like, we need to adapt faster. How do you create an even more vigorous adaptation or evolution culture at Berkeley? It's like, if you're a higher ed institution and you're not thinking about that question, it's sort of like, oh my gosh, it sounds very operational, but it's like a necessary condition to getting the kind of work we need to get done over the next 10 years. All right, I'm going to give you one example in this area, and this is an area where Q&A, I'd love to hear some examples from other people. Here's the one thing that, it's not the only thing, but here's the one thing I will use as my example. I have told people at Berkeley, we are moving Berkeley from a no because culture, no because operating culture, to a yes if culture. Yes if. I have used the phrase yes if about 100 times in the last week. So the idea, look, if you think about it this way, as higher ed people, as scholars, we are geared to be skeptical. We are geared to be skeptical. And I think the staff that we attract are geared to be skeptical. They're thinkers. And the students we are gearing them to be skeptical, right? That's what critical thinking is all about, or a big part of what it's about. And so that creates a lot of if conditions, right? Sort of like, here's a new idea. It's like, yeah, but we've tried that before, or, what about this? Or we don't have the money and this sort of stuff, right? It's sort of like, yeah, those are if conditions. And from now on, we are going to bring our creativity to eliminate or mitigate those if conditions. And the default is yes. It's no longer no. And a lot of people have told me, I've been in meetings where somebody will say, we got a pretty cool idea brewing, right? And then some if conditions get sorted. I'll give you a concrete example. This is literally last week. Senior person comes up to me and said, wow, we had this idea. We were getting excited, a few things. And then somebody said, but we don't have the money. And it died. Founders don't have the money either, right? Entrepreneurs don't have the money. Could we run a pilot with 10% as much money as you'd like to have? Could we write a proposal to a philanthropist? If it's that good an idea, we can probably fund it. Philanthropic, come on, we gotta move on. You can tell I'm getting a little activated here, but we need to get better at this. Yes, if, and that, by the way, yes, if doesn't mean we always add. We always add. Some of these are ideas about what could we stop doing, or what could we do less of. Those are hard ideas. It's easy. Well, we shouldn't do that, and yeah, it's sort of like, no, we might actually have to bring our creativity to eliminating or mitigating the if conditions around not doing that thing anymore. Okay, so small example, but we need to increase that clock speed of adaptation. And this is one cultural, right? One behavioral norm. Last comment, and then I'll turn it back to Minu and Michael. Somebody said to me the other day, I'm hearing in some meetings that I'm in, there's a person, couple layers below me in the organization. And not that we're too hierarchical, but I don't interact with this person all that often. And she said, I was just in a meeting and somebody used yes, if in the meeting. And it's like, oh, that's kind of the stuff of culture change, right? We are on the front end of this culture change. But when you start hearing it disperse, you start to feel like, oh, there's I'll go back to that phrase. There's something happening here. I'm going to stop there. Back to you. Thank you for listening.
Rich, that was a lot to unpack across those 4 points. So I'm going to invite our audience here to put in your questions. We already have several that have come through. I see all the reactions and the hearts and the applause that's going up. So let's just get right into it. I want to make sure that we can address as many questions as possible. So keep the questions coming. But let me start with this, Rich. I read the book, The Startup Campus, and you had written in the foreword to that book, you had used the phrase instrumental university. And today you've laid out the argument for a generative university. How are those phrases related for you, and how should we think of the instrumentality versus the generativity?
Yeah, thank you for that. We were kind of debating which word to use when we were putting that forward out there. So an earlier version of it actually used generative. I think part of it was that the word generative sometimes gets too connected in people's minds, or rather connected in people's minds to artificial intelligence, to AI, right? Generative AI. And we didn't want to lean too far into that. I think, the idea of instrument. So Clark Kerr, he was the first chancellor of UC Berkeley, and he wrote a book called The Uses of the University, right? To what use shall we put ASU? To what use shall we put Berkeley over the next 10 years? And I use that phrase, but effectively I was borrowing the phrasing from his book. And so I think that leans strongly into thinking about us as instruments. What is the work, the heavy lifting that society, that America needs these great universities to do, and that's very much getting debated, and I think productively debated. So that's why we leaned into instrumental. But my instincts, it's sort of like, well, that generativity and the connection to the flywheel metaphor. If I had said, instrumental and flywheel, I think it would have been harder to buy that metaphor.
That is helpful indeed. I'm going to give a nod to one of my ASU colleagues who is a quadruple bear and go with his question first. He does acknowledge that he owes a lot of his trajectory to Berkeley's public mission, and he was struck by the phraseology of universities being society's most valuable assets. So here is his question. How do you see Berkeley renewing or redefining that public mission in the next decade, especially in an era when publics are under political and financial pressure in a way that privates are not?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, because it is fundamental. We are a public university, and a public university is, I think, most fundamentally about values and accessibility and scale and things like that. If somebody said, well, Berkeley's budget is only, 12, it's roughly 12% funded by the state of California now. It's sort of like you're not really public anymore. That's a definition that just looks at publicness in terms of where the money's coming from. Actually, I won't use any private university in particular, but you could think of some great private universities in the state of California. And if you actually said, if you add up, especially a private university with a medical school, if you add up the amount of state funding that Berkeley gets and the amount of state funding that a great California private university gets, which is mostly zero, and then you add to it federal funding for the public university in the state and federal funding for the private university in the state. So that's public. You could say that's not state publicness, but that's publicness. Those private universities are, if they have a medical school, Berkeley does not, are receiving much more public funding than Berkeley is. So anyways, publicness, and this is in the question, is really not about how you're funded, unless you want to start redefining everything to the dollar, which we don't. So how do you create that public mindedness, right? So Berkeley, I'll give you a few examples. A third of Berkeley's incoming undergraduate class every year is transfer students from California community colleges. It's like, we're very proud of that. That's a big part of why the UC system generally, this is true across the University of California system, it's true at Berkeley as well. But it's part of where a lot of that economic mobility engine comes from. These are older students, they're grittier, they're very thankful to be here, they've worked hard. Anyway, so that idea of not just economic mobility, but upward mobility, however you want to define it, it's like that's a really important thing for us. And we operate at a scale that is, we're not 30% larger than most great private universities, right? We're 4 to 5 times larger. And ASU has been so terrific on this front. It's sort of like, no, we're going to do this at scale, and we're going to become an even more formidable upward mobility engine for America. It's like, I hope everybody cheers around those things, right? Those are really important things. So I'm increasingly talking about, public vibe and public mindedness, public values versus, is there such a thing as private vibe and private mindedness and private values? It's sort of like, I don't want to over contrast those things, but so many of our faculty are at Berkeley because we are public, because it still means something that Berkeley is public, that we still operate in a different way. And that's part of my job, is stewarding the values that maintain that publicness in my view.
I saw Michael just turned on his camera. Michael, do you have a question or a comment?
No, just that I think that last thing was really, really important. So I would just add that. I mean, it is this notion of public duty and public responsibility within the democracy, and those of us that are a part of these public institutions, that's our duty. That we're here to advance the society to higher levels of success, which means there's different ways to do that, but ultimately we have to try to advance everyone, not just some people.
Rich, I'm going to go back to the list of questions. There are a lot of questions around the idea of the flywheel and the equity piece. Couple of them organize themselves around the themes of interest, challenges, and risks from the equity participation model, and how can an institution with public mindedness as a core value address what might be inevitable bumps in the road going that route.
Thank you. Well, it's an important question. I also want to, like, for example, somebody could say, and nobody's saying this, but I just thought I would say it because I think it's helpful to get clarity on what we're talking about. If somebody said that the pension and endowment portfolio of UC Berkeley should not invest in startups in any way, no venture capital investment, it's not consistent with our values, that would be a ridiculous thing to say, I think. Right. And so the idea that Berkeley has positions in small companies on its own balance sheet, right, on its own central ledger, it's not on its face something that we should say that's not right. Now, if you say, well, it starts, there could be conflicts, there could be misalignments, we could make decisions we shouldn't make, those are legitimate questions. But there's no kind of on its face rejection of this idea. Now, I think part of it too is if you said, well, wait a minute, if you are putting Berkeley's resources at risk, it's like, that's a problem. I mean, that's a problem. But remember what we just said. Remember the channel. I'll give you one or two more of the channels, but I think you have to kind of see the channels. And these are not, by the way, not a single one of those 15 channels have I taken resources that would be available for other things and allocated them to buy equity in startups. Not in one case. And I think that's where the spirit of this question is coming from. It's sort of like you're putting money at risk that was going to support doctoral students, and you're hoping it's going to work. That's actually not what we're talking about. So just real quickly, licensing acquired equity, right? You could say, well, you dialed down, royalties in the future, but it's sort of like, well, usually payouts are faster under equity than under royalties. And you could say, yeah, we put something at risk by dialing that down. But the shared carry funds, right? It's like we didn't put any capital into those funds. If you can ask, what's the quid pro quo? Why would a general partner actually sign up for that? It's sort of like, well, they're getting access to startups and other things. I could go into it, but there's no capital provision from the university to that general partner that gets that deal working. All right. The philanthropy, obviously, so the philanthropy came in. It was restricted. We have to use it this way, right? Now you could say, yeah, but couldn't you have got the philanthropy and just journaled it over into support for graduate students or whatever? It's sort of like, no, not in those cases, right? It was sort of like this person got really excited. These people, it was more than one person, got excited about this idea that we have these shared carry funds and wanted to support it. It's like, wow, great. I'll give you one other example that is consistent with this overriding theme that we are not putting capital at risk that we could be using right now to fund, and I keep using doctoral students as an example, but to fund the library, to fund whatever new education. And here's the example. And this one's really quite interesting. Most equity positions that we have, or that ASU has, any of us have, come with what's called a participation right. The right to invest in future rounds, that startup says in the future, we need to go to the capital markets and get some money, and we're going to sell equity in the future. To have a right to participate in a future funding round is actually, it's called an option, and that options are valuable. And we have created a norm where I got an email a week ago from a faculty, I'm not going to tell you his name, but you would know him. And anyways, I better not say any more about that. But the email said, I'm starting another company. I'd like to give the university some equity in my company. And I'd also like to give you a participation right in the company. So that now participation rights do involve, if we choose to use Berkeley capital to invest in the company, then we're getting into that category that I think the questioner was asking. But part of what we can make available to those shared carry general partners, we can share, because they have an affiliation agreement with Berkeley, we can share our participation rights with those general partners. That's incredibly valuable to them. And that does not involve putting our own capital at risk. So at least so far, we are not putting fungible capital at risk in building that spreadsheet.
So I'm really curious about the philanthropists who are specifically giving you resources to put into these share carry funds. Is this a recent phenomenon? Has this been something that has been building towards? Do you see a larger movement of this happening?
Well, thanks for the question. It's very recent because these shared carry funds are very recent. The very first one on the Berkeley campus launched maybe 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. It was called the Berkeley Catalyst Fund. And it came out of our College of Chemistry. And there were some PhDs in our College of Chemistry, former PhDs, who were getting into money management and said, let's start a fund that looks like this and we'll give. So, to get into the details, it's sort of like part of the upside compensation for a general partner, the person owning the fund or making the investments in the fund, is 20% of the upside. So Berkeley's getting half of the 20% of the upside. Berkeley owns 10% of the returns on that portfolio. That's the way to think about it. And so they launched that, and then the category sort of took off. It's like, wow, we know how to do this. And I won't walk you through all the 7 names. The list of the shared carry funds are on that website that I just mentioned, iande.berkeley.edu. You can find all of them. But I think once certain donors saw those and said, that's a cool model. And they wanted to actually fund, each of these funds has a different focus area. And so these were donors that gave to a specific fund because it's like, I want that general partner to be able to invest more in companies coming out of Berkeley in that specific area. And I want Berkeley to get the returns on the tail end.
That is a really exciting movement. It opens up all kinds of new possibilities for universities with philanthropists who are willing to invest in this particular way. As you were talking about the point number 2, the flywheel, there are a couple of questions here that raise a concern of, is this approach going to favor business, engineering, those traditional disciplines that have the capacity to launch enterprises that are of interest to philanthropists, funders, and others? Where do you see the role for humanities and the arts in this space?
This is a super important question. And I've used the phrase fund the core, and I've mentioned the libraries and the doctoral students and so forth. But this is really important, right? If this is sort of just serving school X, Y, and Z out of a portfolio of 20 or 30 schools or departments, it's like that cannot be the narrative for this, multiversity, this wide angle university or ASU or any other. So we do our very best to keep the returns on all these different, I mentioned the spreadsheet and 15 different rows. You think about that as 15 different channels. We want to keep the returns in those channels as unrestricted as possible, right? And like so here's something that my predecessor, Carol Christ, who so ably led Berkeley before me, one of those gifts, I won't mention the size, but I mentioned the 75 million in philanthropy. One of probably the biggest one of all the gifts that added up to 75. One of the things Carol did is on the front end, she said, I think it was 25% of the resources that come out of this down the road, 8, 10, 12 years, need to go to capital renewal. Or deferred maintenance, whatever you want to phrase it. But it's sort of like, no, that's some of the hardest stuff to fund. And that doesn't, and it didn't say capital renewal and engineering, right? It was like capital renewal. And our humanists and some of our buildings and support for the humanities, because external funding is thinner there, is where we need to keep investing. So we have to make sure that this model, this flywheel, is supporting our humanities and our social sciences. So we do our best to keep it as unrestricted as we can.
How else are you thinking about developing a sustainable business model for the core mission of the university? There are a couple of questions here about, as state funding plateaus and federal funding is diminishing. How are you thinking about the core mission?
Well, this is the big question for all of us. I think, we're under so much pressure as people start thinking about, just to break it down into revenues and expenses. I mean, if you start thinking about the different main revenue items, I think, the sticker price ain't the price that most people are paying, right, at these great universities. But even if you net out grants and other things, and you ask what's the effective price, the net price that people are paying, right? I think people are looking at the pricing of education services and saying, especially as you go lower down the quality tier, and saying, that there isn't much room there, okay? So you've topped out. And if you look at sort of the inflation adjusted increase, at least in the sticker price of higher ed, you see that in fact it's really moved a lot. I mean, the real increases above inflation have been significant. Okay, so I think it's not easy. So part of this, one of the things that I said, and so this is part of the search process of the chancellor, and this is one of the things I'll just put it on the table. And I said, all right, let's paint a picture of UC Berkeley 10 years out. And some of the things I've already talked about were in that picture. But here's one of the things that I said. We are going to put perennial financial austerity behind us over the next 10 years. And it's sort of like, what? I mean, you better have a rabbit in your hat. Because if somebody said, we're really going to advocate in our state capital, Sacramento, more effectively now, it's like, that's not a rabbit. If we'd said, we're really going to stoke our capital campaign this time, it's like, well, we had a very successful capital campaign. All right. So this equity, now it's sort of like, show me a spreadsheet. If I said, oh, we've got 15 channels, don't worry, we're going to be fine. People would say, not enough. I mean, show me the analysis. I want to debate the assumptions in the spreadsheet. It's like perfectly legitimate, right? That's the kind of skepticism I welcome, because let's walk through it, right? But I think so that's part of why this flywheel came in this direction. And like every other university, we are trying to think about the revenue side in fresh ways. But this feels like by far the most interesting revenue generating direction. On the expense side, it's like, wow, I mean, it's very, very difficult. One of the things that we've done, and I think, ASU is ahead of us in this, but we've got what we call it the expense growth model or the expense growth methodology. We're just trying to get much firm, not just in tough years, but like in every year, this expense growth methodology. And our, at least right now, our gestalt is to give the flexibility to the unit level leaders so that they can get their expense growth down. But we need to bend that expense growth curve down. It ain't, excuse my language, it ain't all about revenue growth.
I love the phrase, put perennial financial austerity behind us. I think there'd be a lot of university leaders who would want to be able to say that.
Well, and as you know, I'm an economist. There's never a point where you say we have all we need, we're just fine, right? But it's the word austerity. It's sort of like, it's always just like all the shocks are negative. The morale, sucking effect of always feeling like we're always making hard decisions here. And so, I'm using austerity in that sense.
Lots of questions here on the culture component. So I want to start with one on faculty. How should you or universities in general encourage innovation and entrepreneurship among faculty beyond the usual suspects, business and engineering? How does this culture really take across the institution?
Well, thanks for that. I think especially as we think about, the public entrepreneurship and civic entrepreneurship and other categories other than private. But I'll give you one example. When people ask me, all right, if you had to pick one thing and only one thing that most moved faculty culture to get comfortable with the idea that entrepreneurship among faculty, and translational research was okay for Berkeley to lean into more. I think it was something, and you may have something very much like this. At Berkeley, it was called the Baker, B-A-K-A-R, Baker Fellows Program. And the Baker Fellows Program was launched about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, a little over a decade ago. And what it did is it basically said, we're going to provide translational research funding. So it was very much about kind of resolving mostly STEM. So this doesn't fully answer your question, but was resolving some of the remaining scientific, hypotheses or questions. And so it wasn't a giant amount. It was $300,000 a year for 3 to 5 years, and you could get a follow-on grant if you were showing progress and things like that. And there was a review committee, and I helped with that. So did a lot of other people. Bottom line is, it's like, that's 7 a year. Well, that's 7 a year for 12 years. That's 80 people. And the last round that I participated in, there were over 40 faculty who submitted a grant application. So if you multiply 40 by 12, and it's not always a separate or independent group, you're spanning an awful lot of our STEM fields. And one of the neat things is that our social scientists were jumping in on this. They were jumping in on database companies or analytics, or economists were jumping in, other people. We had fewer humanities submissions, so I'll be perfectly honest about that. But I think that, and when that was launched, just to be clear, this was donor funded. It's donor funded. And the donor, when you look at, because I remember this, the founding donor document said, here are the three main goals of this program, this Baker Fellows program. The second of the goals, as I recall, it was second on the list, was we want to provide translational or commercialization research grants, right? So proof of concept grants. It comes under different names. But the first goal, and it was listed first, shifting faculty culture. Back to that intention idea, right? It's like, it would be easy to leave that off. And it was launched by Paul Olivasatos, who was then the provost. He's now the president at the University of Chicago. Paul himself, great scholar, and he'd created some companies. So it wasn't just like, oh, we have some new funding, we're not really talking about it. It's sort of like the chief academic officer of the university, who is himself a founder, is saying, this is a good thing, you should apply. And so, all of those pieces help to shift culture. So, but I think we need to make sure that, as we think about, for example, community engaged scholarship and some of these other scholarship areas that are very humanities and social science inflected, we're still working on how do we get more people, at the table in these entrepreneurial activities, even if they are civic or public sector institutions.
I want to shift to a couple of questions here around students. And I think this notion of they do that versus I can do that, I think that resonated with a lot of people and resonated with me as well. So the question here is, from your perspective, how does the physical campus environment act as an input into that culture change for students? The interactions, incentives, and spillovers that build that agency. And where might the campus evolve to strengthen those effects?
Well, it's a lovely question, and that's work in progress, as it is, I'm sure, at ASU and other. It's just a lovely question, and I think, but the more we can bring intention to it, I think the better. I was asked, I did a podcast. It's called All In. It's a forum and podcast that many people may have heard about, and I was on the stage with Sion Bilak, who's at Dartmouth, president, and this question came up to each of us as part of that. And the question was basically, if you could teach more of any one thing, what would it be? And the thing that came out of my mind was this word agency. I mentioned, it's like, we need these people, to act on the world, to borrow Steve Jobs' world, to want to leave a dent on the world, right? To act. So as we often say, which is appropriate, we're not teaching them what to think. We're teaching them how to think. And it's sort of like two thumbs up on that, of course. And both of those involve thinking. We want them to act, to have an impact. That's part of our job, is impact, right? Long-term societal benefit, right? But part of that we affect through our students, right? So we want them to act, but part of that is a mindset. It's sort of like, again, from they do that to I do that. So I haven't answered the question yet, but I love the premise of the question, is like, how do we do that better? So we have a new course. I'm happy to share a syllabus if anybody wants it. It's called, not so new, it's 2 years old now, but it's part of the Berkeley Changemaker program. It's called Living with Agency. It's like, interesting. What does that look like, right? We have another new course that's part of the Berkeley Changemaker program that is called Openness to Opposing Views. And it's exploded. I mean, students are, anyway, so it's been super powerful. And then, the whole immersive learning, getting your fingers dirty. Just this last weekend, I'll use this as an example. Our College of Engineering, we have something called the Richmond Field Station, which is a 20-minute drive from Berkeley. But it's like they're creating all these solar-powered cars, and the things that are happening at lots of universities. It's not like only Berkeley, but it's like this dedicated place for self-driving vehicles and for testing things and propellants and rockets and it's really quite remarkable. And drones and designing drones. Okay, but here's what struck me. It's like, every university does some of that, right? But it's sort of like, I got to meet the heads of about 15 different clubs, and one was drones and one was rockets, and okay. And they all were club leaders. And somebody said only 25% of that club is engineering students. Bang, that taught me something, right? Because there are a lot of clubs at Berkeley or ASU or other, that are impacted. It's like students would like to be part of it. It's sort of like, no, we're selective. You have to be interviewed. It's sort of like not very inclusive. These get your hand like really dirty, like you're out there at this field station and you're launching rockets and stuff. It's like, oh, that's crazy interesting. And you don't have to be an engineer to do that. And so, anyways, it's like, and part of the note to self for me is I need to tell that story more often, right? Because just that idea of it's inclusive and okay. And so I'm not saying we have the panacea, but I think part of it is telling the story of there are these crazy things. Now, the last thing I'll mention is we have something called the Berkeley Discovery Platform. The Berkeley Discovery Platform. And it's easy to find the website. And it's basically immersive experiences, co-curricular experiences, research internships, all this stuff. It's sort of like it existed 10 years ago, but there was no centralized place where students could go and find it. Now, finally, we've had this for the last few years, and I'm sure you have something similar at ASU, but I'll conclude on this idea because I find it very helpful. If you said sort of, how do we build agency at Berkeley, right? Okay, so the amount of agency we're building, left-hand side of the equation, okay, I'll just call it A equals all the opportunities at Berkeley for building agency. It's like, well, they're like many thousands times navigability, N. We have not been investing enough in navigability. AI gives us very new ways to increase N. If we increase N by 20%, we've increased agency by 20%. And AI allows us to do that, but we didn't need AI to think more purposefully about N. And I find that, so this Berkeley Discovery Platform is kind of like, oh my gosh, let's keep going with N.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but even as you were speaking, I just want to go back to college again. I want to be in these spaces where I can meet other people from different disciplines, hang out, and have that agency to actually build something and do something without waiting to be an adult well into your career before you can do that. So it's wonderful that students on our campus and your campus and many others have the opportunity to do just that. But I do want to come back to the AI piece, and I did watch the interview with you and Sian, and you both talked about this notion of agency and teaching students not what to think, but how to think. And so where do you see AI, helping with this notion of both the flywheel idea for faculty and staff who are involved in the institution, and then for students, so that changes or if the culture evolves in some way powered by AI in new ways? How are you thinking about AI in all of this?
Well, all of us are thinking about this. I'll use the word struggling with this, right? Because I think we've all seen some of the negative consequences where it's sort of like that is not a stronger thinker as a result of AI, right? We've all seen a lot of that, and there are plenty of examples. And we're still in like inning 1 or 2, right? So I think the quick answer is no one really knows. We need to run a lot of experiments, and we need to move through them quickly and learn from them. But I had a conversation with a founder. I won't mention the name. I thought that's not important, but he was working with another university, and he was here at Berkeley over the weekend. And he kind of asked this very same question because he wants to support that, right? And one of the things I said is, look, the fact that you're going to need to talk to the faculty if you're gonna like make this at scalable at all, okay? And then I think and this just, I'm not saying this is the perfect answer. It just happened 2 days ago. All right, so I said, say this to the faculty. Can we agree that we are not in the business of teaching what to think? We're in the business of teaching how to think, and every faculty member will agree to that. And that critical thinking, right? Critical reasoning, that as we think about strengthening people's cognitive abilities, that's really a central purpose of the university. Every faculty member will agree with that. Then I said, and then you could propose to them that I want to propose some AI curriculum and AI offering that is designed to advance exactly that. And if you tell me that this is at an angle, this is not that, it's doing something else, we won't do it. But let me take our shared goals, just for simplicity, critical thinking, and let me invest, he's a philanthropist, a bunch of money in advancing the AI critical thinking cross product. It's like, love that idea. And I think faculty will love that idea. And then it kind of holds yourself to some discipline, because it's sort of like, no, that's not what we said we were going to do. You're right. It's not, or at least it's not obviously so. But we need to find that common ground where people that want to help us, not just philanthropists, but that we can start to say, yeah, that's because we can all imagine a setting. Like, just as an example, when I was 18, I was at Michael mentioned this, but I got to Berkeley. I'm 18, sort of. What do you know? I don't know. I didn't know very much. And Berkeley kind of exploded my world. Neither of my parents had a 4-year degree. So, the idea that I would get a Ph.D. and become an academic, it's like, you can't be what you can't see. It's like not even close, right? And I remember saying some things in like cocktail parties of my parents about politics this or politics that. It's like, man, you aren't even a half an inch deep. You don't know what you're talking. Nobody said it that way to me. But after the fact, I'm hearing them kind of respond. It's like, okay, I need to think more deeply about that the next time. But imagine if I had an AI bot, an AI agent. It's like, yeah, test your ideas against, everything that this great conservative has ever written, and test your ideas against every great progressive idea that this thinker has written. And it's sort of like, wow, that would have sharpened me up at 18. Anyway, sorry to keep going on, but I think we can all see pathways that would really be scaffolding of critical thinking, and we know we see pathways that won't be.
Yeah, as you know, we've embraced AI in its many manifestations at ASU, and we continue to, like you, think about all the ways in which we can use AI to be better and to help our students have a better, richer learning experience. I want to come back to, I loved your equation of agency, coming back to the notion of navigability. We are a really large institution, 194,000 students, over 100,000 are online. Navigability is a complex issue. How are you thinking about bringing more equity into that process for every kind of student? You talked about the older student coming in from community college. Then there's the 18-year-old coming straight out of high school. How do they all navigate this environment such that they build the agency or just extract the most value from their learning experience?
Well, it's a lovely question that we're all confronting. I don't have any obvious grand solutions, but I think if you take that equation seriously, you start to think about the interoperability of the university completely differently. So let me talk about the user interfaces on Berkeley. Pardon using the tech jargon, right? And navigability is kind of like, what's the efficiency of your user interface? I find that a helpful metaphor. So I'll give you a concrete example. And again, I'm not mentioning this example because we're way out ahead of everybody. I think we were behind everybody, or we certainly weren't ahead. All right, we have something that nobody knows about, or nobody that I talk to knows about. It's a faculty expertise directory. So if you said, how do I navigate as a policymaker? I'm in the state of California, at Sacramento, or I'm in DC or whatever, right? Just think about policymakers, people that are writing laws and thinking about how to write them. It's like, well, how do I find out which Berkeley faculty work in that area? Well, even the staff members in those offices don't know this directory exists. It does. Okay, so you could say, well, let them know it exists. But it's sort of like, all right, let's be honest. That directory. So if you wanted to find me and you didn't know my name, which you wouldn't if you were just kind of trying to find out who works in a given area, you would put some keyword. It's got a subject line. You put a keyword in. Look, I put the keywords that are in that database. There were probably 6 of them, and 20 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, you're just not gonna find me. And I've written a lot and done a lot since then that are okay. So it's really clunky if you're thinking about, imagine, so here's flipping. I'm an economist. Economists create 2 kinds of models. I'm grossly oversimplifying. We create models that are incomplete information, like I don't know exactly what you know, and you don't know what I know, and we're all trying to get along with it, right? So that's the world. We also write down complete information versions of those economies or models, just to see like how much better would they operate. So if somebody had imagine you're a policymaker in Washington, D.C., and you have complete information about not just what Berkeley's research faculty are all doing, but also their advanced graduate students and also their postdocs. Berkeley has as many postdocs on campus as they have, research faculty. And you would know, okay, there are 27 of them, and here's the subset of 8 that are really close to what I'm doing. And okay, it's like, boom. All right, that's not the world we live in, but it's like, that's all right. So what we did is we put a little button on it, and it's called Bear GPT. The bear is the mascot for Berkeley. And we just put an AI engine behind it so that it could find things that wouldn't be found. I'll give you a concrete experiment. Sorry, but this is it's like drill into it and then realize, oh my gosh, we're not even close to kind of that full information navigability. And so I put the word longevity in the subject line. And this was like 3 months ago. So I think this would still give you the same result. In the traditional version of it, you actually have to click Bear GPT to get the AI version. So you can run this experiment. Longevity. People weren't using that word to describe their research 20 years ago. Most of them weren't. Now it's the hottest word out there, right? So I put longevity in, nothing. Then I clicked Bear GPT and I put longevity in the same subject line. Boom, like 7 or 8 people, here are 3 or 4 sentences on what they're working on. And so it's like, that's not like 10% better. That's like infinitely better. So anyways, I use that as an example because if you said, to what use shall we put ASU? To what use shall we put Berkeley? It's sort of like, what are user interfaces? Write down 100 of them. There are more than 100. How do we actually increase the navigability, the effectiveness of every one of those interfaces? It's like, we don't normally use that kind of language. And I think we're at a moment right now where it's like, let's start using it and then let's push ourselves.
I like the focus on user interfaces, and with AI, we can certainly make some significant progress in new ways if we just focused on those user interfaces. So really appreciate you going there. I want to pivot to questions about clock speed. And Michael uses the word clock speed nearly in every other set of public comments he makes. So I can see there are kindred spirits here. So how do you balance the tension between needing to be adaptable and accelerate on that clock speed with the traditional deliberative nature of what public institutions do and shared governance and traditions that have allowed us as universities in some ways to deliberately be slower than the rest of society? How do you balance that tension? How do you even think about it?
Yeah, well, this is right at the, governance at the end of the day is kind of the kernel of every big issue, right? It's like who decides and is it legitimate? I remember learning years ago from somebody who's an expert in leadership. It's sort of like the effectiveness of a decision or an initiative, the effectiveness equals the quality of the decision or the initiative times its acceptance. If acceptance is 0, it's ineffective. You're going to lose, right? And so that's just another. I like simple equations with 2 factors. So there's another one. But so how do you get Q times A? How do you get acceptance working? And at least at Berkeley, I think it's the same at ASU. But faculty governance is huge. It's huge. Often when I have the most difficult issues, my first call is to the chair of the faculty senate. And we don't always agree. Of course, we shouldn't always agree. But it's sort of like, I don't want anything to surprise him. And it's currently him. And he helps me through it. And we're not perfectly aligned, and we know that. But so anyways, that's just one concrete example of how are we going to get some of the difficult things done together. Does it slow us down? Yeah, at some level it does. I mean, but it increases A. I mean, speed isn't by itself the goal, right? It's like if E equals Q times A, effectiveness, it's like E is the goal. And I need to invest in A. And at least at Berkeley, A is a lot about faculty governance, not completely, but there's also a lot of A in staff, right? It's sort of like, so one of the things that I find hardest as a leader is when, look, in this current environments. Let me call it a political environment. It's not only political, it's social, it's cultural, it's lots of other things. But in this political environment, when you have to make a difficult decision, it's often hard for various reasons to explain exactly why you made the decision. That rips my heart out. It's sort of like, I want to be transparent as a leader. I want to talk about, yeah, this was really hard. There's some people that are angry at me. Here's what we did. Here's why we did. It's like, you can't say that. You can't say that publicly. It's like, but that's why you can't say that. And it's sort of like, that, okay, so I'm getting to a point now where it's sort of like, where are the limits on what I just said? I mean, it's sort of like, how do you build A when you can't say as much as you'd like to say? Now, I can call the chair of the faculty senate and say whatever I need to say. So that's not the point. But the question is, in the larger community context that is the university or our alumni base or the public, oh, it's like, oh my gosh, there's just so much. There are degrees of freedom that have been lost, and it constrains leadership.
Yeah, governance is indeed a complicated issue at many levels. I want to extend that idea to thinking about how we prepare the next generation of university leaders to do the things that you just laid out in the talk today. Right? If we are going to be generative as universities, how can we prepare leaders to come into these roles being able to do these things? You've had a particular trajectory. The role that you held at Berkeley previously helped you do a lot of this work of culture building and setting the university on this track. What about everybody else who aspires to be a university leader? How do we get this kind of thinking, training available?
Yeah, well, it's a lovely question. I think this was under Paul Olivasatos. I've mentioned his name before. He's now at Chicago, but well, there was a group of people when he was provost that launched at Berkeley, I'm going to say 7, 8 years ago, a faculty leadership academy. And we never really had a focused leadership academy for faculty who'd already distinguished themselves in leadership at one level or another, but would be natural candidates in a few years to be a dean of something, or whatever it is, to be running a big program. And that ended up being a really good investment. We may have been late to that game. I'm not here, crowing, no pun intended, about Berkeley doing that. But I think that it's like, I look back on that and I think, oh my gosh, that was really valuable, because a lot of the people that are becoming deans now are people that went through that. So anyways, that's one element of it. And then I think, part of the question is like, well, what kind of development is most important for a program like that? It's easy to launch a program. It's hard to think about the content, and we haven't necessarily solved that. But I'll just give one example, because I got to serve in industry as the chief learning officer for a big bank. I went on leave. I've been an academic my whole life, but I went on leave for 2 years, and I was the chief learning officer at a big bank. And I got to see inside the engine room of how that bank manages its culture. I sat on what was called the operating committee of their HR group, human capital management, they called it. And so it's sort of like, here are the levers. Here's how we manage culture. Sort of like, I'm an economist, right? Culture management, that gets taught in business schools and other places by social psychologists and so forth, not by economists. So that was like eye-opening to me. And then I came back to Berkeley, and it's sort of like, wow, I'm not seeing at Berkeley, and I think it's true in higher ed, anywhere near as much intention around culture shaping as I got to see by having taken those 2 years of leave. And it blew my mind. Now people would say, I kind of mentioned this before. I'm not sure. I'm like obsessed with culture. It's sort of like, having seen that, it's sort of like almost everything I start with a culture lens. So that's just one of those areas where it's like, look, this, as a scholar, as an academic, I'll bet this is one of your blind spots. It's just this is not the way we were shaped. And it was incredibly eye-opening for me. So anyways, I think part of the design of a faculty leadership academy, or whatever shape it takes at your university, that's one of the things I would put in there, because it's important and it's valuable.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We have 6 leadership development programs at ASU, all with that exact intent of what does it take to lead here, and both faculty and staff leaders really preparing that next generation from within. But certainly more could be done across US higher education if more universities are to become generative in the way you've just described. I'm
Yeah,
watching the clock.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt,
go ahead. Go ahead.
but here's another thing that it's, I'm sure you have something similar. We developed a document. I was dean of the business school, as was mentioned before this, and we created a document. Others have done this, called a primer on fundraising at Berkeley Haas, at the business school at Berkeley, right? And it was the audience was staff and faculty. There was an internal document, sort of like, here's what a major gift officer does. Here's how you plan a campaign. Here are some, people say you're not going to get a $10 million gift unless you have a $10 million idea, and little aphorisms like that. But the most valuable thing at the end was a single page that said, here are the top 10 gifts that the Haas School has ever received. And we're going to try and replace one of those every year. And big gifts are very lumpy, and that's a reach goal. You're not going to reach it every year, but it's sort of like, boom, got it. And most people had no idea what the top 10 gifts were. And so I use that as just a tactical point. It's sort of like any dean on the Berkeley campus. It's like, what are the top 10 gifts your school has ever received? And you think maybe replacing one of those on the list every year is a good goal. That's the kind of thing that you can say in a faculty leadership academy, and it's like, got it. That you just helped me think about fundraising in a much more concrete way, which is, every faculty leadership academy is going to talk about fundraising, but helping people just sort of see, okay, thank you for that. That's an example, I think, of that sort of content.
Fantastic example to sort of create some energy in the culture for people to want to do more. We have 2 minutes to go. There's so much more to discuss, but I want to make sure we are respectful of your time and everybody else's time. So final question. This is from one of our participants. This moment gives us a chance to truly evaluate what truly works, what no longer serves, and how we can build models of collaboration that invest in shared growth and reciprocity and long-term impact. So there's a lot there, and I'm sure you could take more time, but what would you put in the bucket of what no longer serves? What should we leave behind as universities in order to move into a more generative future?
Wow. It's a controversial one. That's all the time we have. Thank you very much for listening. It's a really good question because those are the hard things, right? What do we say now? I'll give you a kind of a first level answer and then try to answer it in more substance. We just did, so every president or chancellor has a cabinet, kind of a set of chief staff. And the cabinet meeting we just did at Berkeley, it was sort of like, each of us went around the table. It's like, what are you going to stop doing? What are you going to stop doing? And over what time period? And we wrote those down, and we're going to go back to them. It's like, how did that work, right? Now, some stop doings you're going to restart because it's sort of like, wow, the blowback on that was so big. But we're going to hold ourselves to account. Now, these weren't giant things like we're going to shut down, a college or something, right? But these were personal things. And so I think that helps build a culture, right? Of stoppage is something we need to work on as a group. When I think at the university level, part of it is, so Berkeley and ASU, our faculty are, I think of it as like federated creativity. Our faculty are doing what they're curious about. Go to the edge, move the edge. All right. So that's what there are also a set of structures around the way we do research, because we have things called centers and we have things called institutes, and we have, and we need that, right? It's organizational. But there's some fixity in those structures, sort of like that center has had the same director for an awfully long time. And do we review centers and institutes? Yeah, but there's fixity in the ecosystem of research. We want as little, I think, fixity as possible, and yet you do these organizational constructs. So that's one area where I think it's worth thinking about, making sure that our faculty are fully enabled and feel fully free to discover. I mean, that's just so fundamental. We are not going into a world where we have acceptable questions and unacceptable questions. That is just so important to me and to us, I know. And there are these fixities, there are rigidities, and it's like they're really hard to deal with. I don't know yet how to deal with them. but that's an area where I think we need to reduce fixity.
Well, what a fantastic way to end the conversation. We began with all things generative and recognize that we might need to address some of the fixities to get there. Rich, this has been such a fantastic talk, lecture from you. So many powerful ideas. I'm particularly grateful for the energy you brought into this interaction, for the equations, which I personally love. I would love to see you like publish your equations at some point. The very specific examples you shared that sort of give us a sense and everybody participating of how to actually do these really, really hard things. So thank you for your time, for accepting our invitation. And to our participants, thank you all for being here. I'm sure you're leaving with an incredible set of ideas. Please look at the recording so you can decompress and just absorb all of this in much more detail. And please feel free to share with friends and colleagues who you think would benefit from the ideas that Rich presented here. These are important for ASU, Berkeley, and I think for US and global higher education. Thank you, everybody.